Okay, in this video we'll talk about chapter 7, which is neoplasia. Neoplasia literally means new growth, and it typically implies some sort of abnormality in cellular growth, which can be a tumor. So the tumor is just like a new growth. A malignant neoplasm is what we call cancer. So by definition, cancer is neoplasia, but that's malignant. And malignant cancer may not be survivable, but it's usually associated with expression of certain genes that make it malignant or more cancerous. Malignancy really just means that the cells are invading nearby tissues or invading even distant tissues by cells breaking away and traveling through the blood or lymphatic system to implant on other tissues, and then they keep dividing there. Benign growth is usually easily cured, and if it's benign, that means basically it's not invading any of the surrounding tissues, but rather it's just kind of growing within its own mass that has well-defined borders. Now, malignant tumors can kill a host if it's untreated because these cells are dividing rapidly and uncontrollably and also spreading to other tissues. This can be invasive to that tissue or organ, and that can diminish the function of that organ over time. Now, what happens then is that typically malignant tumors have this tissue-specific differentiation where the cells that are malignant don't closely resemble the tissue of origin. So for instance, let's say if you had a primary malignant tumor of the liver, those malignancies, or the malignant cells in the liver, probably won't resemble liver cells, even though they may have started in the liver. Now we call this anaplasia, and anaplasia is really where cells start to look differently than what they should normally look like. Now, the greater the degree of anaplasia, this typically indicates even more aggressive malignancy. So if a malignant cell looks much different from the surrounding tissue, that it's therefore anaplastic and probably even more metastatic and more cancerous. Now, these cells can grow rapidly, and they may initiate tumor vessel growth. So typically, malignant tumors that are very aggressive can recruit their own blood vessels, which really brings in the blood supply and nutrients to have these malignant tumors grow even faster. However, typically these malignant tumors can be necrotic and dysfunctional. They can become necrotic because they can often outgrow their own blood supply. Because if a tumor grows too fast, there might not be enough nutrients to support those new cells, so it could undergo necrosis. Now, what this slide's showing is basically anaplasia. These are a variety of simple squamous cells, which you can see here. Somewhere in the body, it could be, stratified squamous cells. So it could be like, mucosa, like oral mucosa, or maybe even skin. But these stratified squamous cells you see here are kind of nice and large with kind of pale cytoplasms and a well-defined nucleus. But if you look to the side of it, these are the malignant stratified squamous cells. You can see here that they look much differently than the cells on the left. In fact, we call this anaplasia, where the cells start to look, even just due to appearance, look much different than the original cells. And the degree of anaplasia correlates with the severity of the malignancy. So we can estimate from these pictures that if these cells came from these and they look much different, these are probably pretty malignant types of cells. Now remember, a benign tumor is one which does not invade the surrounding tissue. Now, typically benign tumors don't kill their hosts, but benign tumors can be life-threatening based on their location. So someone might have a benign tumor of the brain, and although benign tumors by definition aren't cancerous, that tumor can still be life-threatening because if it starts to grow within the cranial cavity, it can impinge on other nearby brain tissue. Or if you have a benign tumor of the esophagus, maybe that can block off your esophagus and prevent food from being ingestible. Now, remember, benign tumors don't invade adjacent tissues. They can be encapsulated, so sometimes these benign tumors have their own little fibrous capsule, which they grow within, and it kind of keeps those cells within a particular localized area. And these benign tumors also have a smaller degree of anaplasia, so they more closely resemble their original tissue type. They typically grow more slowly. They don't have a lot of blood vessels. They're rarely necrotic, and they can sometimes retain their original function. So they have slow growth, probably because they don't have a lot of blood vessels, and they're also rarely necrotic because they grow slowly and they probably won't sort of grow faster than their own nutrient supply can provide. Now, what's interesting about these benign tumors is they can often retain their original function. So later on in the class, when we get to the endocrine system, we'll talk about some of the benign tumors of endocrine organs that may actually be functional and release hormones, but this leads to excess of hormones and different endocrine disorders as a result. So benign tumors aren't always, necessarily benign. They can actually cause problems, but they're certainly less severe than malignant tumors. Now, just in terms of some terminology, guys, OMA just refers to a benign tumor. So if we talk about like an adenoma, that's a benign tumor, just ending in OMA. However, if a word ends with carcinoma or sarcoma, this indicates malignant tumors. So if you've ever heard of like an adenocarcinoma, that would be a malignant tumor of epithelial origin. Or sarcoma is again a malignant tumor of some sort of connective tissue origin. So we'll talk about lots of different sarcomas which originate from bone marrow later in the class. So sarcomas, like I said, are of connective tissue origin. So they come from mesenchyme, which gives rise to all of the connective tissue in your body. And things like leukemias, which we'll talk about later in the class, are malignant growths of white blood cells. So you guys want to know what these roots are. So if I gave you a new word and it ended with carcinoma, you should be able to tell me that that's a malignant tumor of epithelial origin. Or if I gave you a new word and it ended with sarcoma, you should be able to tell me that's a malignant tumor from connective tissue. Now, some of the risk factors for cancer are, well, men have a lifetime risk of 1 in 2. So about half of men over the course of their lifetime will probably have some sort of episode of cancer. And the lifetime risk for females in cancer is 1 in 3. So 1 out of 3 women alive today will probably have some sort of cancer episode in their lifetime. Now, for cancers overall, the 5-year survival rate is 66%. And that's fairly high, but it can vary from cancer to cancer. The survival rate can be the survival rate of some cancers, like let's say like skin cancer, can be much higher than the survival rate of another cancer, like pancreatic cancer. Pancreatic cancer has one of the lowest survival rates. But just as for cancer as a whole, the 5-year survival rate is 66%. Now, unfortunately, cancer is the second leading cause of death in the U.S., and most of these cancer deaths occur in individuals over 55. So as we get older, over the course of a lifetime of just being exposed to possibly, mutagenic chemicals or radiation, or even just mutations due to cell division, as we get older, we have a higher and higher risk of cancer. Now, what this slide shows is just some interesting epidemiology of cancer. So if you guys get some time, take a look at some of these different percentages. So 25% for males for prostate cancer, and 31% for lung and bronchus cancer in men. So some of these cancers are pretty common, but this is an interesting thing to look at and kind of get a sense of which ones are more or less common than others. Now, there are some modifiable risk factors for cancer, and we call these lifestyle factors. And so those would be the modifiable risk factors. So some modifiable risk factors for cancer would be things like tobacco use and nutrition, obesity, sun exposure, and sexual exposure. These are all definitely risk factors for different types of cancer that are common in our society and avoidable just by lifestyle changes. Like if you avoid using too many tobacco products, or have decent nutrition, and if you're not as obese, or not exposed to the sun as much, or not having as much sexual exposure to human papillomavirus. Now, what's key, like with many conditions, is early screening is aiding in detection. So the sort of secondary level of prevention is important for cancer treatment, because if you can detect it early on, then you can help prevent further complications of that cancer. Now, remember, tobacco use does play a pretty significant role in tumorigenesis and cancer in general. And unfortunately, the death rate from lung cancer has dramatically increased over the last century or so, and that this is believed to be related to smoking. There's a lot of really strong research out there to indicate that smoking is this thing that's contributing to this dramatic increase in lung cancer. And lung cancer at its moment, at the current time, it's the leading cause of death in men and women and has one of the lowest survival rates. The lungs are a very highly vascularized tissue, so that if cells in the lung do become cancerous, they can more easily spread to other organs and tissues of the body and cause problems all around the body. Now, tobacco use is not only linked with lung cancer, but it's also linked with things like pancreatic cancer, kidney cancer, bladder, mouth, esophageal, and cervical cancers. Because, although you're just inhaling these substances in tobacco, some of those substances do make it into your bloodstream and then get disseminated throughout your body and can have effects on tissues throughout your body. Now, the thing about tobacco is that it contains carcinogens, and carcinogens are basically initiators or promoters of cancer. Carcinogens can be chemicals or molecules that induce mutations in DNA, or they can be chemicals or molecules that promote the growth of cells, which can also promote cancer. So there's lots of known carcinogens in tobacco, and tobacco actually has a high concentration of those carcinogens. Now, secondhand smoke does promote cancer too. So even if you don't even smoke your entire life, if you're around people who do smoke quite a bit, that puts you at risk for developing cancer due to secondhand exposure to those chemicals. In fact, there's some research out now that indicates there's even something called third-hand smoke, which is where you're exposed to the materials that someone may have been smoking nearby. You don't even have to be next to someone while they're smoking, but if someone was smoking in your apartment, years prior, and your walls are covered with sort of the residue of their smoke, that itself could be third-hand exposure, which can put you at risk for cancer. So some pretty caustic stuff. Now, what this slide is showing is basically some of the different cancers, age-adjusted cancer rates in the United States over the last 100 years or so. And you can see that many cancers are on the decline. So stomach cancer is dropping dramatically, and this probably relates to the fact that we're ingesting less foods that are high in salt, if that makes sense, because we don't eat as many preserved foods over winter. But you can see some cancers are increasing, like lung and bronchus cancer. So airway cancer has been rising dramatically. In fact, if you look at this, it's risen what looks to be about 100 times as much as it had been 100 years ago. So, it is on the decline in the last 20 or 30 years because of, sort of more of a public understanding of the risks of tobacco use. But what's happening, though, is that even though the lung and bronchus cancers are on the decline, we still see an increase in lung and bronchus cancer deaths because there's still people dying from the cancer that they're getting, even from maybe when they smoked decades prior. That still puts them at risk for lung and bronchus cancer. But if you look at other cancers like colon and rectal cancer, pancreatic cancer, breast cancer, these are all on the decline, it appears, at least in the last 20 years or so, probably at least in terms of deaths, because of better treatments out there. There's some pretty good chemotherapeutic drugs, and early detection is sort of better utilized now in the healthcare field. Now, what's interesting is that there are some nutritional aspects to tumorigenesis and cancer. So things like fat, fiber, alcohol, and antioxidants all play a role in your cancer risk. Now, what's interesting is that diets high in fat are linked with breast, colon, and prostate cancer. So let's say if you eat a lot of fatty foods, that can put you at risk for these types of cancers. Diets that are low in fiber put you at risk for colorectal cancer. So if you're not eating a lot of fiber in your daily diet, that can increase your risk for colorectal cancer due to the accumulation of kind of like fecal sludge in your digestive tract, which causes irritation of cells, causes metaplasia, dysplasia, and possibly even cancer. Things like alcohol use are related to breast, esophageal, laryngeal, and liver cancer. And what's interesting too is that antioxidant use is linked up with all cancers. Now, there's still some debate about how antioxidants play a role in cancer development. Now, antioxidants in a moderate amount help sort of prevent certain cancers by helping out with the health of cells. However, excessive intake of antioxidants can promote cancer because your immune cells use oxidants like free radicals to kill off cancer cells. But if you're taking an excessive amount of antioxidants, you could actually be inhibiting your immune cells from preventing cancer cells from dividing. So that excessive antioxidant use can be associated with all cancers. So it's important not to, overdo it with the the pill antioxidants every day. Now, some of the genetic mechanisms of cancer include carcinogens, like we talked about. These can be agents like chemicals that cause cancer, or maybe even radiation. But what's interesting too is that we get these things called proto-oncogenes. Basically, a proto-oncogene is a overactivity of a cancer-critical gene that contributes to that cancer. So, for instance, a proto-oncogene could be a gene that normally encodes for a growth factor. However, if this gene is abnormally active, like if it's overactive, and you're making a lot of growth factors, that cell can start to divide rapidly, and this can contribute to cancer. Now, oncogenes are the genes that we talk about as really the ones that cause cancer. Usually, it's not one gene that causes cancer. It requires a lot of different things to go wrong. But an oncogene is basically a proto-oncogene in its mutant and overexpressed form. So we talked about a proto-oncogene might be like a growth factor, and if it's slightly active, that can promote the overgrowth of cells. Well, what if that gene encoding a growth factor became mutant and overexpressed to where you're creating so many growth factors that all of the surrounding cells start dividing rapidly and uncontrollably to the point where they become malignant and therefore cancerous. So oncogenes could be, something like that. But there's other types of oncogenes too. Oncogenes could be genes that are related to the cell cycle, maybe genes that prevent cancer by inhibiting cell division. So we'll talk a lot about these throughout patho. Now, tumor suppressor genes are your body's genes that normally inhibit cell division. And when these tumor suppressor genes are not active enough, then your cells can divide uncontrollably, and that can contribute to tumor growth, or basically, precancerous growth. Now, remember we said how proto-oncogenes usually encode for things like growth factors, receptors, signaling molecules, and transcription factors. And if these things become mutated and excessively overactive, all of these can contribute to the overgrowth of cells. Obviously, signaling molecules that cause your cells to divide, if you're expressing too many of those growth factors, then your cells will divide way rapidly. Or if you have more receptors for those growth factors, then your cells can be more sensitive to what few growth factors might be present. There could be some signaling molecules in the cell which cause your cell to divide, or transcription factors that can turn on or turn off cancer-critical genes. Now, what this slide is showing is just some of the different mechanisms that can contribute to cancer. So some proto-oncogenes could be different genes and chromosomes and across these different cells. And with this example, what it's saying is that you might have overactivity of a gene that encodes a growth factor, and this growth factor can cause your cell to divide more rapidly. Or you might have overexpression of a gene that encodes for a receptor for growth factors, and by having more receptors, then your cell is more sensitive to those growth factors. Or it could be a gene that encodes for things that are necessary for the cell to divide, so the cell just might divide more rapidly. Or they could be genes that encode for transcription factors that cause other genes to be more active, and that can make your cells divide more rapidly. Now, growth factors are also called mitogens because basically they initiate mitosis, hence the name mitogen. Now, these growth factors are basically small manufactured peptides by the cell, and they're secreted into the extracellular material or space where they can diffuse throughout extracellular fluid and then bind to nearby cells through autocrine signaling. Now, these growth factors will interact with receptors on target cells and possibly cause those cells to divide. Now, typically these growth factors are important for things like development, like when you're growing as a fetus and a child, how you'd want your cells to divide and grow larger. However, as an adult, you want these growth factors to become less active because you don't need your tissues to continually grow. However, in adulthood, if these growth factors are overactive, that can basically induce mitosis, which can cause cells to have overgrowth, and that might lead to cancer. Now, some of these receptors that respond to mitogens can be within the plasma membrane, or they could be inside the cell. They can activate enzymes that can cause the cells to divide. Now, once those mitogens bind to the receptors, they'll cause cells to proliferate or divide. And if you have excessive amounts of receptors or excessive amounts of mitogens, or basically growth factors, that can cause cells in a particular tissue to divide more rapidly. And that can cause basically tumorous growth, which could become benign or malignant. Now, we talked about how proto-oncogenes were sort of genes that could cause cells to divide, and if they're overactive, then you see a lot of cell division. But proto-oncogenes have the capability of becoming an oncogene, and an oncogene is basically the proto-oncogene in its mutant overexpressed form, where it causes the cells to divide inappropriately and so rapidly that they have disorganized growth, which causes malignancy. Now, there's different things that can cause proto-oncogenes to turn into oncogenes, some of which can be viruses, like retroviruses. So, example of a retrovirus would be like HIV. It can insert its genome into your genome, and sometimes the HIV virus can actually induce proto-oncogene to oncogene formation. So there are some forms of basically blood cell cancer that are related to HIV. We'll talk about those later on in the class. Now, there could be a mutagenic event like exposure to chemicals or radiation, or DNA sequences could be lost or damaged, again, through exposure to chemicals, radiation, or viruses. Now, what this is showing are just some different examples of how proto-oncogenes can be turned into oncogenes. So, like, for one, sometimes a virus can actually cause cells to become cancerous. Otherwise, exposure to radiation or chemicals can cause cells to become cancerous. Or maybe damage to DNA that causes amplification of a proto-oncogene and therefore becomes an oncogene by being overexpressed. Now, some retroviruses that cause proto-oncogene to oncogene formation would be things like HIV, Epstein-Barr virus, which is a type of herpes virus, human T lymphocyte virus type 1, and HIV is associated with something called Kaposi sarcoma, which is one of the signs of HIV infection. Epstein-Barr virus can cause Burkitt's lymphoma, and this lymphoma is basically a benign growth of, of lymphocytes that's caused by this type of herpes virus. And the human T cell virus type 1 also is associated with leukemias and lymphomas. So it's interesting that viruses can be related to cancer. Now, what's interesting is that all these retroviruses are RNA viruses, and the way that they insert their genomes into our genome is they have something called reverse transcriptase, which is an enzyme that converts RNA into DNA, and then there's another enzyme called integrase, which can insert that DNA virus genome now into our genome, where the virus can actually hide in our chromosomes. Now, tumor suppressor genes are genes that normally help prevent cell division. However, these tumor suppressor genes can promote growth or cancer when they're not present or when they're inhibited. So if tumor suppressor genes are inhibited or mutated to where they don't function properly, then that can promote the development of cancer. So it turns out that carcinogenesis, or basically cancer formation, is more of a multi-step process. Typically, it's not one event that causes cancer. Usually it's a multi-step process that leads to the progression and proliferation of cancer. But it usually starts with DNA damage. So at some period of time, exposure to radiation, whether it's in sunlight or other types of high-frequency radiation like gamma radiation, like in X-rays, can cause DNA damage, which helps initiate the genes that can promote growth of cells. Now, what happens then is that as those cells start to grow, they can start to release other growth factors, which can cause nearby cells to grow. And as these cells start dividing, they can start to take on a cancerous phenotype through rapid cell division. And if these cells start dividing so rapidly and releasing so many growth factors that these cells start leaving their tissue site and start looking more anaplastic, that's when we have progression of that cancer to different stages, like well, of stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. A stage 1 type of cancer is one that's localized to its original tissue. Stage 2 is where it's localized to the tissue and it's started to invade nearby tissues. But stages 3 and 4 are the metastatic variety of cancer progression, where the cells have now broken free and are spreading to other areas of the body. Now, initiation of cancer can come about from carcinogens, and these carcinogens are chemicals or just injurious agents that can injure DNA and promote the proliferation of cancer. And there's things called partial carcinogens that can just promote growth. So they're not really going to cause cancer necessarily, but they may promote growth enough to where these growing cells that can accumulate mutations on their own randomly, and that can become cancerous. So an example of a partial carcinogen could be like stomach acid that can reach your esophagus. And that stomach acid can cause your cells in the esophagus to grow more rapidly. And as those cells start growing or dividing more rapidly, they can accumulate mutations randomly that can actually lead to cancer. What's also interesting too is that for the severely anaplastic cells, because they're dividing so rapidly, we see structural changes to chromosomes as well. So, if the chromosomes have a normal, nice kind of rounded structure, we see that they start to look more disorganized and possibly even jumbled around because these cells can be dividing so rapidly that the chromosomes don't form properly. Now, metastasis is the process where cancer cells can really break free and spread to other sites of the body. This is kind of where they escape from their original tissue and form colonies in distant sites. Now, there's different enzymes that these cells can release that can make them better able to digest through their own tissue and spread to other tissues in the body. Things like proteases and collagenases can digest things like your basement membrane and extracellular matrix, and that itself can start to help release those cells to other areas of the body. And if those cells spread, then we call that metastasis. So what this slide is showing is basically just a pictorial view of metastasis, where this might be something like a cancer cell, where if it starts secreting these enzymes, and the enzymes start breaking down that basement membrane and extracellular matrix, the cell can start to wiggle through that basement membrane and start to spread to other tissues of the body, either through blood or lymph. Now, the cancer cells are typically going to spread through your circulatory systems, so like through your blood or lymph. And usually, in order to be certain about where the cancer cell came from, you have to perform sort of a genetic analysis on it to understand, okay, well, is the cancer cell I'm finding in the lung, did that cancer cell start in the lung or did it start like in the kidneys or the liver or skin? Really, the only way to be sure of that is to do some like tumor marker identification. So like looking at certain enzymes or gene transcription that correlates with certain tissues. Now, the reason why we want to find out where the cancer cells came from is it helps us track tumor activity. So for instance, we might not know immediately whether or not a tumor is metastatic if you find a tumor in someone's lung. However, if you do a lung biopsy and you find that those cells that are growing in the lung actually are expressing genes that are consistent with cells of the skin, then you can understand, okay, well, that's stage 4 skin cancer, where now skin cells have spread or disseminated to other organs of the body. Now, one thing that can really increase the capability of cancer cells to grow rapidly is this idea of angiogenesis. So angio means blood vessel, genesis means to form. So angiogenesis is a process where tumor cells can actually secrete growth factors that help blood vessels grow into the tumor, or at least near the tumor. Now, by promoting angiogenesis, these tumors can grow more rapidly, and often the tumors that do have angiogenesis are better able to divide rapidly and spread. So when you think of like a more aggressive tumor, they are typically going to be the ones that can undergo a lot of angiogenesis. Now, inhibition of angiogenesis is an important therapeutic role because if you can prevent tumors from recruiting their own blood vessels to grow into the tumor, then you can prevent that tumor from growing too rapidly. Unfortunately, with more recent research, it's proved more difficult to prevent angiogenesis because there's a lot of redundant pathways in this mechanism. So you'd have to block, hundreds of different pathways, not just one angiogenesis pathway. So it would require a very unique cocktail of drugs, which hasn't still yet been well established. Now, in terms of the grading and staging of tumors, we'll talk about this throughout pathophysiology. But what happens is that tumor grading and staging occurs like more or less on a 4-stage scale. We have stage 1 to 4. And stage 1 is where the tumor is still in its original tissue. Stage 4 is where you're finding that cell now metastatically in another distant site. And the stages in between kind of describe what those cells are doing in between, like whether they're in lymph nodes or where they are like in the surrounding tissues. And we'll talk about this grading and staging system later on in the class. Now, staging is where you talk about the spread within the host. We can also have staging that's based on the size of the tumor, the extent of the local growth, the number or location of lymph nodes that are involved, and as well as the location or number of distant metastases. So the reason why we have this staging and grading system is that different cancers that are consistent with a certain stage and grade can respond better to certain therapies. So if you can understand somebody's stage and grade of a tumor, then you can actually treat them with a certain method that's more effective. What this is showing is just a CT scan of someone's abdomen. You can see all of what's in yellow here is basically the tumor metastasis, and you can see that it's all over. So tumor appears to be in the pelvic cavity, near the bladder. It's up near the liver. It looks to be kind of in the like the stomach, intestinal area, as well as around the heart in the mediastinal cavity. So this is just to show, like, this would be a stage 4 type of growth where you find these tumor cells have spread to many different sites and they actually are metastasized. This would be a form of cancer. Now, the effects of cancer in the body can be wide, and ultimately it depends on where the cancer is located. So it depends on the sort of the location extent of that metastasis. Early stages can be asymptomatic or symptomatic, but as the tumor increases in size and spreads, these symptoms become more pronounced or more apparent. Some of the more obvious signs and symptoms of cancer are things like cachexia, which is a sort of wasting look in the body. If you look at this picture, this gentleman looks to be kind of malnourished. And the reason why individuals that have widespread cancer look more malnourished is those cancer cells are highly metabolically active, and they could be using a lot of that individual's nutrients for their own cell growth, which can actually lead to a form of malnourishment from the cancer itself. If you also look at his eyes, his eyes kind of appear to be sort of yellow. And that yellowing is actually kind of a jaundice that can happen, where tumor cells can actually spread to your liver, because the liver is a highly vascularized organ, and that can lead to a form of liver jaundice that can be associated with cancer. Now, some of the warning signs of cancer can be things like, our mnemonic here is caution. So caution means change in bowel or bladder habits, sore throat that does not heal, unusual bleeding or discharge, thickening or lump in the breast, indigestion or difficulty swallowing, obvious change in a wart or a mole, or nagging cough or hoarseness. And these are all sort of warning signs that are correlated with different cancers in the body. Talk about GI cancer or skin cancer. It could be skin cancer or GI cancer here, or breast cancer elsewhere, GI cancer or skin cancer or even respiratory cancer. So if we think about the mnemonic caution, think about these particular changes that can indicate cancer, and this is important to know. Now, this is different than the warning signs of cancer in children. In fact, we use a different type of mnemonic for cancer in children. In fact, what's kind of cool about this is that our mnemonic is children. So the C in children means continued unexplained weight loss. H is headaches and vomiting in the morning. I is increased swelling and persistent pain in bones or joints. L is lump and mass or abdomen, neck. D is development of whitish appearance in the pupil. R is recurrent fevers not caused by infection. E here is excessive bleeding. And N is noticeable paleness. Now, the reason why we have a series of different signs and symptoms for cancer in children is that there are some cancers that are more common in children. So, for instance, like a lump in the mass or abdomen in the neck could be indicative of something like lymphoma or leukemia, or development of a whitish appearance in the pupil of the eye can be consistent with a form of cancer of the retina in children called retinoblastoma. Or excessive bleeding and bruising could indicate also like a leukemia lymphoma. So think about this particular mnemonic when you're trying to understand the warning signs of cancer in children. Now, I mentioned earlier how cachexia just means weight loss, but just cachexia is just sort of this wasting syndrome where you have a loss of appetite, increase in metabolism, and nausea, vomiting, and that leads to a generalized weight loss and anxiety that we call cachexia. Now, what happens, you guys, is that often cancers can suppress the immune system because a lot of your immune cells could be devoted to fighting that cancer, and by diverting your immune system away from fighting other pathogens, then it leaves that person more immunocompromised and they can be at higher risk for infections. Now, bone marrow suppression can occur during leukemia and lymphomas. What you'll find is that if it's a bone marrow type of cancer, this can contribute to things like anemia, which is low red blood cell count, leukopenia, which is low white blood cell count, and thrombocytopenia, which is low platelet count. And the reason why we see low, basically, blood element count is due to an invasion and destruction of bone marrow by cancer cells. Or it can also come from poor nutrition and chemotherapy. So some other effects of cancer could be hair loss and sloughing of mucosal membranes, or paraneoplastic syndromes. Now, the hair loss and sloughing of mucosal membranes isn't caused usually by the cancer itself, rather as a more dramatic side effect of the chemotherapeutic drugs. Because those chemotherapeutic drugs target cells that divide rapidly, often hair cells and mucous membrane cells, because they divide so rapidly, they're also affected by the chemotherapeutic drug, even if they're not cancerous. So we can see a lot of sort of weakening of those tissues and hair loss during chemotherapy. Some paraneoplastic syndromes could be where as those cells start dividing, they actually might start releasing their some different hormones. So what's kind of odd is that some types of cancers can release hormones that can lead to other syndromes like hypercalcemia or hypercortisolism, which is basically called Cushing's disease. So it's kind of interesting that cancer cells can also release hormones. All right, guys, so thanks for paying attention to all of these week 1 lectures, and I look forward to making more of these videos in the future.